never thought that a simple journey home could turn into a nightmare. My name is Ethan Carter, and what I'm about to tell you is not something I would have believed if I hadn't lived it. It was a cold January night, with mist covering the road like a veil of secrets. I was driving along the B3270, that winding road that cuts through the outskirts of Wokingham, returning from a late visit to my sister. The clock on the dashboard read 10:43 p.m. when I noticed the silence. Not that ordinary silence, but something oppressive, as if the world had held its breath. The road was deserted, not even a pair of headlights in the distance, just the sound of my car's engine and the muffled rumble of the tires on the damp asphalt. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was easy to blame tiredness. A long day at work followed by a 2-hour journey could leave anyone exhausted. But there was something about the road that night that seemed wrong. It was then that I saw it for the first time. A figure tall and indistinct standing by the side of the road. My headlights illuminated just enough to reveal the outline of someone dressed in a long coat, as if from another era. I thought about stopping, but instinct screamed louder. Shh, walked straight past, feeling my heart racing. For some reason, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, but something was wrong. It had no face. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a vague, pale shape, like an empty mask reflecting the light from the rear lights. I swallowed, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Some young idiot trying to scare the drivers. But something about that figure made me uneasy, as if it didn't belong there, or in this world. I carried on driving, trying to convince myself that it was all a figment of my imagination. The radio was off and the silence inside the car seemed to pulsate, echoing the emptiness of the road. Every kilometre I travelled made me feel more isolated, as if the road was stretching out endlessly in front of me. Then, suddenly, the lights on the dashboard flashed. The engine choked and the car began to lose speed. A wave of panic washed over me. The last thing I wanted was to get stuck in that place. I parked on the hard shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest as the engine died with a final gasp. I took a deep breath and tried to start the car again. Nothing, just the hollow sound of the engine trying to start. Outside, the darkness seemed thicker, as if the night itself was watching me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't coming from the road, but from the bushes that surrounded the lane. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if something or someone was approaching. I took out my mobile phone to use the torch, but the battery was almost dead. Of course, as if the universe was conspiring against me. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was almost deafening. I didn't know what to do. Staying in the car seemed safe, but every fibre of my body was telling me that I wasn't alone. And then someone knocked on the passenger window. The knock on the window sounded like an explosion in the silence, making my heart leap in my chest. My breath caught, and my fingers clenched the steering wheel as if it would protect me from whatever was outside. I didn't dare turn my head straight away. Something about it felt wrong, deeply wrong. When I finally plucked up the courage to look, my stomach churned. The same faceless figure was standing outside the car. There was no mistaking it. That long coat, the rigid posture, and that disturbing absence of any human features. This time it was closer, so close that the dim moonlight revealed the dull sheen of smooth, inexpressive skin. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of my tired mind, but the thin, long fingers pressed against the glass were all too real. There was something about the way the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, as if savouring the moment, that made my instinct scream at me to get out of there. My hand trembled as I tried to turn the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled and coughed, but didn't start. The figure tilted its head to the side as if studying me. The gesture almost seemed curious. "Go away," I muttered to myself, more of a prayer than an order. As if it had heard, the figure took a step backwards, disappearing into the darkness. My relief lasted only a second. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps returned, but this time around the car. First to the right, then to the left, circling like a predator analyzing its prey. The only light came from the car's dashboard and the pale glow of the moon. My mobile phone flickered with 2% battery left, and the torch seemed more like a sliver of hope than a useful tool. I switched it on anyway and pointed it at the glass, trying to see beyond the reflection. Nothing, and then I felt it. I didn't see it, but I felt it, a presence behind me, like an invisible weight pressing down on the air. The rearview mirror was tilted, and my eyes caught a movement. Just a blur, but enough to make me turn my body so fast that I almost dislocated my shoulder. Nothing. The back seat was empty. At least it seemed to be. I was caught between the urge to get out of the car and the paralyzing fear of facing whatever was out there. That's when I heard a different sound. Not footsteps, but breathing. Shallow, irregular, as if something was struggling to exist. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside. The torch trembled in my hand as I pointed it at the back seat again. The light found the empty upholstery, but the feeling that I was being watched persisted. And then, as if the car itself was conspiring against me, the windows began to fog up, slowly, from the inside out. Shapes began to appear in the vapor. Not words, but symbols, scribbles that I couldn't decipher. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to echo in the small space of the car. It was impossible to tell whether it was real or the fruit of my tension-torn mind. A metallic sound interrupted my thoughts. The driver's door handle was being pulled, again and again, as if someone was trying to force it. I locked all the doors, in a desperate reflex, but the sound continued, insistent and relentless. The figure was outside again, now bent over as if trying to peer through the fogged glass. For the first time I felt that empty face had an intention. It wasn't curiosity, it was hunger. All I could do was close my eyes. Perhaps it was a childish reaction, but for a second I thought that if I didn't see it, it might disappear. The door handle stopped creaking. The breathing, that irregular breathing, also stopped. The silence returned, but there was something about it that bothered me more than the sound itself. It was a silence that seemed to watch, as if it carried invisible eyes. When I opened my eyes, the figure had disappeared again. There were no footprints around the car, no physical signs that it had actually happened. But the windows were still fogged up, and the scribbles in the vapor remained there like scars in the air. I decided to get out of the car. The feeling of being trapped in such a small space, surrounded by something I couldn't understand, was suffocating. I grabbed my mobile phone, now down to 1% battery, and opened the door with the caution of someone treading on thin ice. The road was plunged into almost solid darkness, interrupted only by the timid light of the moon and the reddish glow of the car's taillights. The air seemed heavier outside, laden with a sticky dampness that clung to the skin. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, fragile and without authority. I didn't expect an answer, but the sound of my own voice brought fleeting comfort. I took a few steps around the car, trying to find some sign of life, or of something that could explain what was happening. That's when I heard it. First, a whisper, so low that it seemed to come from inside my head. Then another, coming from the darkness to my left. They were words, but not in any language I recognized. They sounded like wind coming through gaps, carrying a disturbing melody that wouldn't go anywhere. I turned in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing but still trees and dancing shadows. However, the whispers were multiplying, overlapping, until they formed something close to a word. Stay. That word, that single word, made something inside me shatter. There was no anger or threat in it. It was a plea, a desperate plea that seemed to drip pain into every syllable. Even so, my desire to run was greater. I turned around, but as I approached the car, I realized something that hadn't been there before. The lights on the dashboard were flashing like a heartbeat, and within the blur on the windows, the symbols that had once been scribbles now formed a clearer pattern, almost like a map, or a message that I wasn't yet able to understand. Before I could take another step, an invisible hand seemed to grab my ankle, forcing me to stumble and fall. On the ground, the earth was strangely warm, pulsating as if it were alive. Stay. The sound came again, now closer, almost inside me. I tried to get up, but my hands seemed glued to the ground, as if the earth had come alive and was holding me there. The pulse under my fingers was irregular, almost like the drumming of a heart in agony. With a desperate effort, I managed to break free and crawled away. Every centimeter gained felt like a battle, while that one word kept echoing in my mind: stay. The car was still there, but something about it seemed different. The taillights now pulsed like a lighthouse lost in the storm, casting shadows that danced on the tarmac. Inside the blurred glass, the shapes kept changing, but this time I began to understand. They weren't just scribbles, they were figures, faces. I swallowed and walked towards the car. My legs were shaking so badly that they felt like they were going to give way at any moment, but the need to understand was greater than the fear. As I got closer, the faces became clearer. They weren't human, or at least not anymore. Their features were distorted, as if they had been stretched and torn by something that should never have existed. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered, sending a shower of shards across the floor. I threw myself backwards, shielding my face with my arms, but the noise was soon swallowed up by the suffocating silence. When I looked again, something was running down the edges of the broken window. It wasn't glass or blood, but something in between, a viscous, pitch-black substance that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. That's when I felt it. I didn't hear footsteps or see movement, but I knew I was no longer alone. I turned round slowly, and there he was, or her, or that. A tall, curvy figure with arms too long for a human body. The skin, or what should have been skin, seemed to be covered in the same black substance that came out of the car, dripping like tears from some living nightmare. The face was the worst, or the lack of it. Where the eyes should have been, there were only deep holes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. The mouth was an irregular slit, as if it had been ripped open by force, and from it came that sound. The sound that I thought was the wind, but now realized was the creature's own whisper. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, or so it seemed. Time stopped, and I felt my mind starting to buckle under the weight of it. It wasn't just fear. It was as if my very sanity was being devoured. Why? My voice came out more as a moan than a word. "What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then, for the first time, it moved. Slowly, almost ritualistically, it raised an arm and pointed at the car. I didn't want to look. Every fibre of my being was screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. When I finally turned my face towards the car, I saw something that paralyzed me. In the front window, the figures had changed again. Now, they formed a scene. It was a road, the same road I was on, but there was something different, something familiar. A body was on the ground, lying next to a car identical to mine, and that body was me. I took a step back, feeling my chest tighten as if all the air had been sucked out of the world. No, it can't be. The figure emitted a sound, something between a groan and a laugh, as it pointed at the car again. This time, the figures changed yet again. Now they showed a cycle. The car, me, the road, always the road, always returning to the same place. Stuck. The word resounded in my mind, not as a whisper, but as a scream. At that moment, everything around me began to fall apart. The trees, the road, even the moon disappeared, as if someone had erased the world with a giant eraser. And then all that was left was emptiness. I woke up with a jolt. My body was drenched in sweat and the air around me felt heavy, almost toxic. I was still on the road, sitting next to the car, but everything seemed different. The sky above was a strange shade of grey, with no stars, no moon, just an oppressive emptiness that seemed to be watching me. I stood up with difficulty, feeling my muscles stiff and sore, as if I'd been running for hours. The car was next to me, still running, the engine whispering softly, but something about it had changed. It wasn't just the broken glass or the black substance that still oozed from its corners. It was as if the car had a life of its own, pulsing in sync with my racing heart. I looked around, trying to understand where I was. The trees had disappeared, replaced by deformed shadows that wavered like smoke. The tarmac of the road now looked rough, uneven, as if it had been hastily sculpted by trembling hands. A strange smell hung in the air. Iron, burning, and something else, something I couldn't identify. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. Not the creature's whisper, but something more familiar. My voice. "You've been here before?" I turned round quickly, but there was no one. The road was empty except for me and the car. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the grey expanse. "You know who I am." The voice sounded close, but also distant, as if it came from inside my own head. Something stirred inside me. A memory. A fragment of a moment I didn't want to revisit. The images of the car, the road, my body lying on the ground began to flash through my mind again. Faster, more intense, like a film on loop. "No, this doesn't make sense," I shouted, holding my head with my hands. "You chose this." The "you" voice seemed to mock me, each word a blow to my sanity. "Chose what? What do you mean?" "You know," and then I knew. Like a bolt of lightning going through my mind, everything made sense. The road, the car, the creature. It wasn't a nightmare or a parallel reality. It was a cycle, something I had provoked. I remembered the accident, the bright lights coming towards me, the moment when everything went dark. I hadn't survived. This was my hell, a personal purgatory in which I was trapped, reliving my guilt, my choice to accelerate rather than brake. The car, the creature, the sound of the road. They were just parts of me, fragments of what was left. How do I get out of here? I asked, my voice shaky, almost pleading. The voice laughed. "You're not getting out, not until you accept it." Accept what? That this is all that's left. You've made your choice, and now you live with it. I looked at the car, at that pulsating thing that seemed to be waiting for me. Somehow, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to get in. I had to face it, even if it meant losing what was left of me. With slow, hesitant steps, I approached the car. The black substance was still oozing out, but now it seemed almost inviting. When I touched the door handle, I felt the cold of the metal run through me like an electric current. I opened the door and got in. The engine roared, and the world around me began to disappear again. But this time, I didn't fight. I didn't shout. I just closed my eyes and waited. As the emptiness enveloped me, one last phrase echoed in my mind. It's time to start again. If you liked this story, leave a like here on the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you thought of the ending. I want to know how you interpret this cycle. Is it really over? Share it with your friends so we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Until next time.